You have 60 seconds to rethink this. The words didn't sound loud, but they landed heavier than the flashing red and blue lights cutting across the dark street. Naomi Carter knelt on the cold asphalt, her palms steady against the rough surface, her breathing controlled in a way that didn't match the tension surrounding her. A few yards away, Officer Derek Shaw stood rigid, his posture sharp, his voice clipped as he barked orders into his radio, while Officer Ryan Cole hovered nearby, eyes flicking between Naomi and the small gathering of onlookers forming along the sidewalk. The air felt tight, like something unseen was pressing down on everyone at once, but Naomi didn't flinch, didn't plead, didn't even raise her voice. Instead, she lifted her eyes slowly, meeting Derek's gaze with a calm that didn't belong in a moment like this. "You're making a mistake," she said, her tone even, almost measured, as if she were stating a fact rather than defending herself. Derek let out a short, dismissive laugh, the kind that carried more judgment than humor. "That's what they all say," he replied, pacing once in front of her, the beam of a patrol car light sweeping across his uniform, catching the badge that seemed to glow with authority. Around them, the quiet hum of the city continued, cars passing in the distance, a faint siren somewhere far off. But here, in this small circle of tension, everything felt suspended. Naomi's car sat parked behind her, a sleek black vehicle that now looked out of place under the harsh lights, like it didn't belong to her in Derek's eyes. He had already decided that, already written the story in his head before she even spoke. Ryan shifted slightly, adjusting his stance, his grip tightening just enough to show he was following orders, even if something in his expression suggested hesitation. Naomi noticed it, just for a second, the flicker of doubt, but she didn't turn toward him. Her focus stayed on Derek. "I need to make a call," she said again, this time more deliberate, each word placed carefully, like she understood the weight behind them. Derek shook his head, waving a hand as if brushing the request aside. "You can make all the calls you want later," he said. "Right now, you follow instructions." There was a murmur from the crowd now, quiet voices trading assumptions, questions, judgments, whispered just loud enough to be heard. Naomi could feel it. The eyes, the weight of people deciding who she was without knowing a single detail. And still, she didn't react the way they expected. No raised voice. No panic. Just that same steady composure, as if she was standing somewhere else entirely, somewhere none of them could see. "If I missed that call," she said softly, almost like a warning wrapped in restraint, "this won't stay local." Derek stopped pacing for a moment, narrowing his eyes, trying to read something in her expression that didn't give anything away. For a split second, the confidence in his stance flickered, not gone, just unsettled. Then it snapped back into place. "Everything stays local," he said firmly, doubling down, his voice louder now, meant to reassert control not just over her, but over the entire scene. Naomi held his gaze, unshaken. The lights continued to flash, painting the street in alternating colors, but something had shifted, quiet, almost invisible, like the moment before a storm changes direction. And in that silence, in that space where no one else seemed to notice, Naomi Carter wasn't the one losing control of the situation. She was waiting. The seconds stretched, not in noise, but in the kind of silence that makes people shift their weight without realizing it. And Naomi Carter remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her eyes steady, as if time itself had slowed around her while everything else kept moving at the same uneasy pace. Officer Derek Shaw exhaled sharply, clearly irritated by her composure, and turned his attention back to the situation he believed he controlled, raising his voice just enough for the growing crowd to hear. "Step away from the vehicle," he instructed again, even though she had not moved an inch, as if repeating the command would reinforce the version of reality he had already accepted. The flashing lights painted long shadows across the pavement, stretching Naomi's silhouette across the road, making her appear larger than the moment intended, but Derek did not see that. To him, she was a problem to be contained, a situation to be resolved quickly and without question. Ryan Cole glanced toward the black sedan again, then back at Naomi, his brow tightening slightly, as if something about the scene did not fully align, but he said nothing, choosing instead to remain in step with Derek's authority. "We have reports of suspicious activity," Derek continued, his tone firm, rehearsed, as though the justification itself was enough to close the case. Naomi listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, but there was a subtle shift in her gaze now. Not fear, not anger, but something closer to calculation, like she was measuring each word against a timeline only she could see. "You are basing that on what, exactly?" she asked, her voice calm, precise, cutting through the tension without raising its volume. Derek paused for half a second, just enough to register the question, before brushing it aside. "On what I see," he answered, the words blunt, final, as if observation alone granted him certainty. A few people in the crowd nodded quietly. Others exchanged glances, their assumptions settling into place, because it was easier to believe the uniform than to question it. Naomi let the answer hang in the air, then lowered her gaze briefly toward her cuffed hands before lifting it again. "And what you see," she said slowly, "is not always what is true." Ryan shifted again, this time more noticeably, his grip loosening just slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face, searching for something he could not quite name. Derek noticed the hesitation and stepped closer, reasserting control with his presence alone. "Enough," he said, his tone sharper now, directed as much at Ryan as it was at Naomi. "We are not debating this." Naomi did not respond immediately. Instead, she turned her head just enough to glance at the surrounding buildings, the darkened windows, the distant security cameras mounted high on steel poles, silent witnesses to everything unfolding below. When she looked back at Derek, her expression had not changed, but her voice carried a weight that had not been there before. "You still have time to correct this," she said. It was not a threat. It was not a plea. It was a statement placed carefully between them, like a line drawn that had not yet been crossed. Derek let out another short laugh, though it lacked the ease of the first one, and shook his head. "You keep talking like something big is about to happen," he said, folding his arms briefly before dropping them again. "It is not." Naomi held his gaze, unblinking. "It already has," she replied quietly, and somewhere beneath the flashing lights and murmured voices, beneath the surface of what looked like a routine stop, something invisible began to shift, not in her favor or his, but in a direction neither of them could fully stop once it started. Ryan Cole was the first to notice it, not something visible, not something loud, but a subtle misalignment in the moment that refused to settle into something ordinary. It was in the way Naomi Carter held herself, not stiff, not defensive, but grounded, as if the asphalt beneath her knees was no different from a polished office floor. It was in the way she chose her words, each one measured, deliberate, never rushed, never wasted. People who were afraid did not speak like that. People who were unsure did not look at you like that. Ryan shifted his stance again, this time slower, his eyes narrowing as he studied her more carefully, not as a suspect, but as a question he could not answer. Derek Shaw, however, saw none of it, or if he did, he refused to acknowledge it. He had already built the narrative, already decided who Naomi was, and everything she said now only irritated him further because it did not fit into the version of events he preferred. "You keep implying something," Derek said, his tone sharpening, stepping closer again as if proximity would force control back into his hands. "If you have something to say it clearly." Naomi tilted her head just slightly, the movement subtle, almost reflective, as if she were considering whether he was ready to hear anything beyond his own assumptions. "I already did," she replied. "You just chose not to listen." The words did not come with heat, did not carry accusation in the way Derek expected, and that made them land even harder. Around them, the crowd had grown quieter, the earlier whispers replaced by a heavier silence, the kind that comes when people sense something shifting but cannot yet explain why. A man near the curb lowered his phone slightly, no longer recording with the same casual curiosity. A woman folded her arms, her expression uncertain now, as if the scene no longer matched the simple story she had formed just moments ago. Derek glanced briefly at the onlookers, then back at Naomi, his jaw tightening. "You are not in a position to tell me what I am choosing," he said, each word clipped, controlled, but edged with frustration. Naomi did not respond immediately. Instead, she slowly adjusted her posture, not to stand, not to resist, but simply to ease the tension in her shoulders, a small human movement that somehow carried more confidence than any argument. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, but it carried further. Position is exactly what this is about, she said. Ryan felt it then, a shift that ran deeper than the surface of the situation, something that made his instincts push against the script he had been following. He glanced again at Naomi's belongings, at the items that had been set aside without much care, and something caught his attention. A small card, partially visible beneath the edge of her bag, marked with a clean design, minimal text, and a seal he did not immediately recognize. It was not flashy. It did not try to impress. But it did not look ordinary either. Ryan hesitated, just for a second longer than before, and that hesitation did not go unnoticed. Derek followed his gaze, his expression tightening as he stepped over and picked up the card without ceremony, glancing at it briefly before letting out a short scoff. "Anyone can print something like this," he said, tossing it back down with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "You think this changes anything?" Naomi's eyes followed the motion, then lifted back to Derek, completely unshaken. "It does," she said. "Just not in the way you expect." The words lingered in the air, heavier now, less like a warning and more like an inevitability. Ryan looked between them, his unease growing, the edges of certainty beginning to blur. He had seen situations escalate before, had followed orders without question, but this felt different, not louder, not more chaotic, but deeper, like something was unfolding beneath the surface that none of them fully controlled anymore. Derek straightened, forcing a sense of authority back into his posture, but the rhythm of the moment had changed, even if he refused to admit it. "We are done here," he said firmly, though the words sounded more like an attempt to close the situation than a reflection of control. Naomi met his gaze one more time, calm, unwavering, and said, "No, we are just getting started." And for the first time since the lights had begun to flash and the scene had taken shape, it was not her who seemed out of place. It was everything else around her that no longer felt as certain as it had just minutes before. The tension did not break. It tightened, pulling every movement in a sharper focus as if the night itself was watching to see what would happen next. Officer Derek Shaw took a step back, not in retreat but in recalibration, his jaw set as he reached for his radio again, his voice lower now, more controlled, as he called in additional units with a tone that suggested escalation rather than resolution. The words were routine, the kind spoken 100 times before, but the timing was not. Naomi Carter watched him without interruption, her expression unchanged, yet there was something in her stillness that made the moment feel less like a command and more like a test he did not realize he was failing. Ryan Cole turned slightly, scanning the street as if expecting something to appear, though he could not say what. The distant hum of traffic continued, but closer now. The air felt heavier, like the space between seconds was stretching. "You are overcomplicating this," Derek said, lowering the radio and looking back at Naomi, his voice edged with impatience. "This could have been simple." Naomi let out a quiet breath, not a sigh, not frustration, just a measured exhale, as if she had been expecting that exact sentence. "It was simple," she replied. "You made it something else." Derek's eyes narrowed, the words landing in a place he did not want to examine. Around them, the small crowd shifted again, but now there was less certainty in their posture, less confidence in their assumptions. The story they thought they were watching no longer felt clear. Ryan glanced once more at the card on the ground, then at Naomi, and this time he stepped closer, his voice lower when he spoke. "Where were you headed tonight?" The question was quiet, almost careful, and for the first time, it was not an accusation. Naomi turned her head slightly toward him, acknowledging the shift without fully engaging it. "Somewhere time-sensitive," she said. "Somewhere I am already late for." Derek let out a short breath through his nose, shaking his head. "You keep saying things like that," he muttered. "Like we are supposed to be impressed." Naomi did not respond to him directly. Instead, she looked past him, toward the line of government buildings further down the street, their windows dark, their presence silent but imposing. "Not impressed," she said after a moment. "Just informed." The word hung there, different from everything that had been said before, carrying a weight that did not rely on volume. Ryan felt it more than he understood it, a subtle shift that made his earlier hesitation grow into something harder to ignore. He looked at Derek, then back at Naomi, caught between instruction and instinct. "Derek," he said quietly, just enough to be heard. Maybe we should verify before. We already did. Derek cut him off, sharper this time. The interruption immediate, almost defensive. I have seen enough. Naomi's gaze moved between them, calm, observant, taking in not just what they said but how they said it, the fractures beginning to show beneath the surface. That is the problem, she said. You think seeing is the same as knowing. The statement was not directed at one of them alone. It landed on both. It landed on the crowd. It settled into the space like something that could not be easily dismissed. A second patrol car turned the corner at the far end of the street, its lights joining the rhythm already pulsing across the pavement, adding to the sense that the situation was growing rather than resolving. Derek straightened, drawing confidence from the reinforcement, his posture firm again as he gestured toward Naomi. You had your chance to cooperate, he said. Now we handle this properly. Naomi looked at him, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something behind her eyes, not fear, not anger, but recognition, as if a line had just been crossed that could not be undone. You still think this is your scene, she said quietly. It is not. Ryan felt his pulse pick up, not from urgency, but from uncertainty, the kind that comes when the ground beneath a situation begins to shift in ways you cannot control. He looked down the street again, then back at Naomi, then at Derek, and realized that whatever this was, it was no longer contained within the boundaries they understood. And standing there, under the flashing lights, with more units arriving and more eyes watching, it became clear that the moment they thought they were managing had already moved beyond them. And Naomi Carter was not the one being pulled into it. She was the one who had been standing at its center all along. The second patrol car rolled to a stop with a low hum, its lights merging into the restless glow that now washed over the entire street, turning every face into a shifting pattern of red and blue. Officers stepped out, slower than expected, their movements measured as they took in the scene before approaching, not rushing, not assuming, as if something about the atmosphere had already signaled that this was not routine. Ryan Cole noticed it immediately, the way they paused just a fraction longer than usual, the way their eyes moved from Derek Shaw to Naomi Carter and then back again, searching for context that had not yet been spoken. Derek, however, moved first, stepping forward to meet them, his voice firm, controlled, laying out his version of events with the confidence of someone who believed the narrative was already settled. Suspicious activity, refusal to comply, possible falsified identification, he said, each phrase clean, rehearsed, designed to leave no room for doubt. The arriving officers nodded, but not fully, not with the automatic agreement Derek expected. One of them, a taller officer with a calm expression, glanced past Derek toward Naomi, studying her posture, her stillness, the absence of panic that should have been there if the situation were as simple as it sounded. Naomi remained where she was, her hands steady, her gaze moving briefly across the new arrivals before returning to Derek, as if the additional presence changed nothing for her. You are expanding this without understanding it, she said quietly. Derek did not turn back to her immediately, choosing instead to maintain his focus on the other officers, reinforcing his authority through repetition. She has been given multiple opportunities to explain herself, he added. She chose not to. Naomi's voice followed, calm but precise. I chose not to explain myself to someone who had already decided the outcome. The words settled into the group, not loud, but impossible to ignore. The taller officer shifted slightly, his attention now more clearly on Naomi. Ma'am, he said, his tone neutral, not accusatory. Is there something you need us to verify? Derek turned sharply at that, the question cutting into his control more than Naomi's statements ever had. We do not need to verify anything, he said, his voice tightening. This is already under control. Naomi looked at the officer who had spoken, acknowledging the question with a slight nod. Yes, she said. There is. Derek let out a breath, almost a scoff, shaking his head as if the situation had become unnecessarily complicated. Here we go again, he muttered. Naomi did not respond to him. Instead, she shifted her gaze toward the edge of the street where a small metal sign stood near the curb, its reflective surface catching the patrol lights, marking the boundary of a restricted federal access zone just a few yards away. Check the jurisdiction marker, she said. Then check the timestamp on your dispatch logs. The instructions were simple. but the way she delivered them carried a certainty that made them feel less like a suggestion and more like a key placed directly in front of a locked door. The taller officer hesitated for only a second before turning toward the sign, walking the short distance and shining a flashlight across its surface. The beam caught the lettering clearly, and his posture shifted almost imperceptibly as he read it. Ryan watched him, his own unease sharpening into something more defined, something that now had direction. "What is it?" Ryan asked quietly. The officer lowered the light slightly, glancing back toward Derek, then at Naomi. "This zone falls under shared jurisdiction," he said carefully. "Federal overlap." The words landed heavier than expected. Derek's expression hardened, but there was a flicker behind it now, something uncertain, something that had not been there before. "That does not change anything," he said quickly. Naomi's voice came again, steady, unhurried. "It changes everything if you stop me within the last 7 minutes." Ryan's breath caught slightly, his mind moving faster now, connecting pieces he had not fully understood before. "Dispatch time," he said under his breath, already reaching for his radio. Derek turned toward him, sharp, immediate. "Ryan, stand down." But Ryan hesitated, his thumb hovering near the button, his instincts no longer aligning with the command. The street seemed to quiet again, the crowd holding its breath without realizing it, the flashing lights continuing their rhythm as if marking the seconds that were now suddenly important. Naomi Carter did not move, did not raise her voice, did not shift her posture, but everything around her was beginning to move differently, as if the moment had tilted just enough for the truth to start finding its way through. And for the first time since it began, the control Derek believed he had did not feel solid anymore. It felt fragile, like something that could fall apart with the next word spoken. Ryan's thumb hovered over the radio for one more second, long enough for doubt to become a decision. And then he pressed it, his voice lower than usual, controlled but unmistakably different from before as he called in a request for dispatch verification. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that everyone standing within a few feet understood something had shifted. Derek Shaw turned toward him immediately, the sharpness in his expression no longer hidden as he stepped closer, his voice tight with frustration. "I told you to stand down," he said, each word deliberate, meant to pull Ryan back into alignment. But Ryan did not release the radio. "Not yet. We need the timestamp," he replied, not confrontational, but firm in a way that suggested he was no longer simply following. The response crackled through the speaker after a brief pause, the dispatcher's voice calm, routine, unaware of the weight those few seconds carried. "Unit requesting confirmation, stop logged at 21:14 hours. Ryan's eyes flicked up instantly, his mind moving through the timeline, the details Naomi Carter had placed in front of them now locking into place with quiet precision. He glanced toward the jurisdiction marker again, then back at Naomi, and for the first time, the uncertainty in his expression shifted into something closer to realization. Derek let out a controlled breath, shaking his head as if dismissing the entire exchange. "That does not change anything," he repeated, but the repetition no longer carried the same confidence. Naomi's gaze met Ryan's briefly, not as a victory, not as reassurance, but as acknowledgement that he had finally looked where he needed to look. Then she turned back to Derek. "It means you stopped me inside a federal overlap window," she said, her voice steady, each word placed with precision. "Which means your authority was conditional." The word conditional seemed to settle heavier than the rest, hanging in the space between them as something Derek could not easily dismiss. The taller officer shifted his weight again, now fully attentive, his earlier neutrality replaced by a quiet focus that suggested he was recalculating everything he had been told. "Sir," he said carefully to Derek, "we may need to pause and verify. We are not pausing anything." Derek cut in, faster this time, the edge in his voice sharper, more exposed. But the interruption did not land the way it had before. The rhythm of control had already been disrupted. Naomi took a slow breath, not out of stress, but as if marking a transition only she could see clearly. "You still have not asked the right question," she said. Derek looked at her, irritation and something else now mixing beneath the surface. "And what question is that?" Naomi held his gaze, unwavering. "Why I am here at all." The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses. This one carried weight, not tension alone, but direction, as if the moment had finally reached the edge of something that could not remain hidden much longer. Ryan lowered the radio slightly, his attention now fully on Naomi, his earlier hesitation replaced by a growing awareness that the situation was unfolding along lines he had not recognized before. "Then answer it," he said quietly. Naomi did not respond immediately. Instead, she lifted her eyes toward the dark skyline beyond the government buildings, the faint outline of structures that represented authority far beyond the street they stood on. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but it carried something deeper now, something that reached beyond the immediate moment. "Because I was not supposed to be seen here," she said. The words landed softly, but their meaning spread quickly, rippling through the group in a way no raised voice could have achieved. Derek's posture stiffened, the confidence he had been holding now beginning to fracture in ways he could not fully control. "That does not mean anything," he said, though the certainty in his tone had thinned. Naomi looked back at him, her expression unchanged, but her presence now felt different, less like someone being questioned and more like someone who had been allowing the question to exist. "It means everything," she replied. Ryan felt it fully then, the shift completing itself, the realization settling in with quiet clarity. This was never just a stop, never just a misunderstanding. This was a moment intersecting with something larger, something structured, something deliberate. And standing there, under the flashing lights, with the dispatcher's timestamp still echoing in his mind, and the jurisdiction line now impossible to ignore, it became clear that whatever authority they thought they had brought into this scene had limits they had already crossed, and Naomi Carter had known that from the very beginning, long before any of them realized they were already standing inside something they did not fully understand. The silence that followed her words did not feel empty. It felt charged, like something had just been set in motion beyond the reach of anyone standing there. And for a brief moment, even the flashing lights seemed less dominant, as if the scene itself was waiting. Then it happened, not with noise, not with urgency, but with precision. A low, dark vehicle turned the corner at the far end of the street, moving steadily, deliberately, its presence cutting through the atmosphere without needing attention. It did not use sirens. It did not rush. And yet, every officer on the scene felt it before they fully understood why. Ryan Cole was the first to turn, his eyes narrowing slightly as the vehicle approached, something about it immediately different from the patrol units, something quieter but heavier in implication. The taller officer followed his gaze, his posture straightening just a fraction as recognition began to form. Derek Shaw did not turn right away. He was still looking at Naomi Carter, still trying to hold on to the structure he had built in his mind. But even he could feel the shift, the subtle change in the air that no amount of authority could override. Naomi did not look surprised. She did not turn quickly or react in any visible way. She simply lifted her gaze toward the approaching vehicle as if she had been expecting it, as if this moment had already been accounted for long before any of them arrived. The vehicle came to a smooth stop along the curb, its engine idling softly, and for a second, no one moved. Then the door opened. A woman stepped out, composed, precise, her presence immediately commanding without a single raised word. Evelyn Brooks did not need to announce herself. The way the officers shifted, the way their posture adjusted almost instinctively, said enough. She walked forward at a steady pace, her eyes scanning the scene once, quickly, efficiently, before settling on Naomi. "Ms. Carter," she said, her voice calm, professional, carrying just enough weight to cut through everything else. Naomi inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, her expression unchanged, as if this were not a rescue, not an interruption, but simply the next step in a process already unfolding. Derek finally turned, his attention snapping toward Evelyn, his expression tightening as he tried to place her, to understand where she fit in the hierarchy he believed he controlled. "And you are?" he asked, the question direct, but lacking the certainty it would have carried minutes earlier. Evelyn did not look at him immediately. Instead, she reached into her coat, retrieving a credential and holding it just long enough for the nearby officers to see, not dramatically, not for effect, but with quiet authority. The reaction was immediate, though controlled. The taller officer straightened fully now. Ryan's grip on his radio loosened completely. Derek's expression shifted, not fully, not yet, but enough to reveal the first crack in his certainty. Evelyn lowered the credential and finally met Derek's gaze. "You are going to release her," she said, her tone even, not raised, not aggressive, but absolute in a way that did not invite debate. Derek hesitated, the pause brief but visible, his mind moving quickly, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed. "We have an active situation," he began, but the words did not carry the same weight anymore. Evelyn stepped slightly closer, not invading space, but closing the distance enough to make the shift undeniable. "No," she said calmly. "You had an active misunderstanding." The distinction landed harder than any accusation. Naomi remained still, her posture unchanged, her presence now reframed not by the situation, but by the response it had triggered. Ryan looked between them, the realization now fully formed, the pieces aligning into something clear and unavoidable. This was not escalation. This was exposure. Derek exhaled slowly, the control he had held now slipping in ways he could not recover with volume or command. Around them, the crowd had gone completely quiet, the earlier murmurs replaced by a stillness that carried something closer to understanding. Evelyn glanced briefly toward Naomi again, then back at Derek. "This ends now," she said. And in that moment, under the lights that no longer felt dominant, it became clear to everyone watching that whatever authority had been assumed at the start of the night had just been replaced by something far greater, something that did not need to prove itself, because it had already been recognized the second it arrived. For a moment, no one moved, as if the entire scene had been paused by a force no one could see, but everyone could feel. Then the shift became undeniable. Ryan Cole was the first to step back, not dramatically, not in fear, but in recognition, his posture changing as he released the last trace of tension he had been holding. The taller officer followed, his stance straightening fully now, his attention no longer divided, but aligned with the presence that had just taken control of the situation without raising its voice. Derek Shaw remained where he was, but the certainty that had defined him minutes ago had thinned into something fragile, something that could no longer hold under the weight of what was unfolding. Evelyn Brooks did not rush the moment. She did not need to. Her presence alone had already reset the balance. She turned slightly toward Naomi Carter, her tone measured, professional. "You are clear," she said, the words simple, but carrying a finality that closed one chapter of the night instantly. Naomi rose slowly, not hurried, not reactive, her movements controlled as she stepped forward, her posture unchanged, her composure intact, as if nothing about the situation had altered her sense of self. She did not look at the crowd. She did not acknowledge the murmurs that had fallen completely silent. She simply stood. Evelyn then shifted her attention back to the officers, her gaze steady as it moved from one face to another, stopping briefly on Derek. "Body cameras remain active," she said calmly. "All recordings are to be preserved and forwarded for immediate review." The instruction was delivered without emphasis, yet it carried more authority than any command Derek had issued that night. Ryan nodded almost instinctively, his hand moving to confirm the status of his device, not because he was told to comply, but because he understood that this was no longer optional. The taller officer mirrored the motion, the rest of the scene following in quiet synchronization. Derek exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as he tried to regain some footing, some version of control. "We followed procedure," he said, his voice lower now, less certain, as if he was speaking more to himself than to anyone else. Evelyn did not respond immediately. She let the statement exist. For a brief second before stepping slightly closer, her tone unchanged but sharper in clarity. "That will be determined," she said. No accusation, no argument, just a line drawn with precision. Naomi adjusted the sleeve of her jacket, a small, almost invisible motion, but one that carried a sense of closure, as if she had already moved beyond the moment while the rest of them were still standing inside it. She glanced once toward the edge of the street, where the jurisdiction marker stood under the fading reflection of the patrol lights, then back toward Evelyn. No words passed between them, but understanding did. Around them, the crowd had shifted again, no longer leaning in, no longer whispering, but watching with a different kind of attention, one shaped not by assumption, but by realization. The story they thought they understood had been rewritten in front of them without spectacle, without force, just through the quiet emergence of truth. Ryan lowered his radio completely now, his earlier hesitation replaced by a clear awareness of how close they had come to something irreversible. He glanced briefly at Naomi, then away, not out of avoidance, but out of respect, as if he now understood that she had never been part of the problem they were trying to solve. Derek remained still, his shoulders squared, but the weight of the moment pressed visibly against him, the certainty he had relied on replaced by the realization that every decision he had made would now be examined from a place far beyond his reach. Evelyn turned slightly, her attention shifting toward the arriving federal vehicle once more, then back to Naomi. "We are done here," she said quietly. And this time, the words did not signal control. They signaled conclusion. The flashing lights continued to pulse, but they no longer dominated the scene. They simply illuminated it, revealing what had been there all along. And standing in the center of it, Naomi Carter was no longer defined by the moment that had tried to contain her, but by the truth that had just dismantled it. The street did not return to normal right away, because moments like that do not simply end, they echo. The flashing lights were still there, painting the pavement in restless color, but they no longer carried authority, only aftermath. Naomi Carter stood beside the quiet federal vehicle, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if the entire encounter had been nothing more than a delay she had already accounted for. Evelyn Brooks exchanged a brief, final glance with her, a silent confirmation that everything that needed to happen next was already in motion somewhere beyond the visible scene. Naomi reached for the door, then paused, not because she hesitated, but because something unfinished still lingered behind her. She turned back, her gaze moving once across the officers, the crowd, the space that had tried to define her without knowing her. Ryan Cole met her eyes for a brief second, and in that moment, there was no tension left, only understanding, the kind that comes too late to change what already happened, but early enough to change what comes next. Derek Shaw did not meet her gaze. He stood still, his shoulders squared out of habit, but the structure behind them had shifted, the certainty gone, replaced by something heavier, something that did not need to be spoken aloud to be felt. Naomi took a step toward him anyway, closing just enough distance to be heard without raising her voice. "You saw a situation," she said quietly, "but you never saw me." The words were not sharp, not punishing, but they carried weight that settled deeper than any accusation could have. Derek's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. There was nothing left that would hold. Naomi held his silence for a moment, then gave a slight nod, not approval, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement that the moment had already delivered its outcome. She turned back toward the vehicle and stepped inside, the door closing with a soft, final sound that seemed to draw a line under everything that had just unfolded. The engine remained steady, the vehicle pulling away without urgency, without spectacle, leaving behind a street that looked the same, but felt entirely different. The crowd began to disperse slowly, not with chatter, not with excitement, but with quiet reflection, each person carrying a version of what they had witnessed, each version now altered by the truth they had not expected to see. Ryan lowered his head slightly, exhaling a breath he had not realized he was holding, then looked down at his hands, as if recalibrating something internal that had shifted. He turned toward the taller officer, exchanging a brief, wordless understanding, both of them aware that what had just happened would follow them beyond this street, beyond this night. Derek remained where he was a moment longer, the flashing lights still moving across his uniform, but no longer defining it. He looked down the road where the vehicle had disappeared, then toward the jurisdiction marker, then finally at the ground in front of him, as if trying to locate the exact point where control had slipped away. But it was not a single moment. It had been there from the beginning. The radios continued to hum softly, dispatch voices returning to routine, but nothing about this felt routine anymore. Somewhere, reports were already being written. Somewhere, footage was already being reviewed. And somewhere beyond all of that, decisions were already forming that would not be reversed. The night moved forward, as it always does, but the balance within it had shifted, quietly, permanently. Because power does not always announce itself with noise or force. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it stands still while others act. And when it finally moves, it does not need to raise its voice. It simply reveals the truth, and lets everything built on assumption fall away on its own.